Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the first ever video on the Simon Talks Music YouTube channel. Now, I've been blogging on my website, simontalksmusic.com, for about 2.5 years now, and I'm finally getting around to actually making a YouTube channel, which was my original goal. And I know I'm gonna look back at this video in a few years and find it incredibly cringy. I mean, it's my first YouTube video on this channel. I haven't really had much experience doing anything like this, so I already know, especially because this is unscripted right now, and I'm kind of throwing this video together at the last minute. Today I'm going to be reviewing 10 albums, all in pretty short reviews. I filmed this about a week ago. Like the I filmed the videos about a week, the reviews about a week before I'm filming this. Um, and yeah, I don't really have a whole lot to say right now. I guess we'll just get into the reviews. As always, everything here is just my personal opinion. I'm not trying to be objective or anything on these albums. And yeah, I think with all that being said, it's time to get to the reviews. So there are reasons I decided not to listen through Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds' entire discography ahead of this review. And by that, I mean I've heard Nick Cave's music is a shit ton to take in. And after listening to this album, the first Nick Cave album I've ever listened to, well, yeah, this one album alone was a hell of a lot to take in. And it makes for a really tricky album to review because there's so much packed into it, and I can't even pretend that I get this album because there's just so much detail and complexity. And one thing I've noticed is how powerfully eerie so much of this is. Now, it kind of feels hard to write this review without mentioning how shockingly eerie it is that, as I'm just now getting around to reviewing this album, which came out in late August, I read along with the lyrics and see the line, Chris Christopherson walks by kicking a can. Yes, I know this is referencing a song by Chris Christopherson, and kicking the can is different from kicking the bucket, but for those of you who didn't see the news, Chris unfortunately passed away last week. And of course, rest in peace, Chris. But I couldn't not mention this. It was just too weird a coincidence. But back on topic of the album, there are so many intentionally eerie moments on this album. I mean, probably one of the most strikingly bleak lyrics of 2024 that I've heard is on Joy when he says, I woke up this morning with all the blues around my head. I felt like someone in my family was dead. I mean, as sad as it is, it's an especially understandable fear considering Nick has lost family members suddenly on multiple occasions. And Conversion has another one of the most fascinating lines I've heard recently. I never really ever was hurt again. Never hurt again. Not even by ordinary pain. And that build up at the end of the song is incredibly powerful. I feel like I'll probably have a lot more to say about this album later on this year. That is, if it makes it onto my top 50 albums of 2024, which I'm guessing it probably will. Although I think it'll be close. Because as much as there's a lot about this album which I really like, the production is hit or miss at points, with Cinnamon Horses probably being the biggest example of a song where the production really doesn't work for me. I mostly like the writing on this track, but the mixing is kind of messy, with the vocals being overly loud at points and the percussion being way too quiet. I feel like parts of this album show an arc of a character who's on a long, seemingly endless journey to try to find some satisfaction, and what this represents in terms of the overall meaning of the album is really hard to figure out, because I can't help but feel like by taking these songs literally, I'm not really doing it justice. I wouldn't be shocked if this album ends up growing on me significantly, but I think I'm pretty confident for now in giving this a light 8 out of 10. I think it's an album I respect and am fascinated by more than one that I outright love as a full project, even though some moments do really hit hard. But I will say this, I highly recommend giving this album a shot. You're not going to hear anything else like this in 2024, and for a certain audience, I think this is going to hit hard on another level entirely. Again, I'm not sure it's totally for me. If I'm being as objective as I can be, this might be one of the very best albums I've heard this year. I highly recommend giving this a chance. This is the fifth studio album from American rock band Foxing, who gained a lot of critical acclaim about a decade ago for their debut album, The Albatross, which I listened to a few times recently, and unfortunately, I just can't say I get the hype at all, mostly due to the incredibly boring instrumentation and vocal performances, which continued for the most part under their next album, Dealer, in 2015, but with better production and a bit more detail that made parts of it stand out a little more, even though I still would not say that album's for me at all. When I think the band's music got a lot more interesting was with 2018's Nearer My God. Although not in the form of a great album, as a lot of the hooks felt like they could have hit a lot harder, and there are some odd production choices on it, which I don't really think work. But there are a lot of really fascinating lyrics on that album, and it gets into some deep philosophical discussion, which might be worth making a separate video about at some point. Well, I do think the 9 Minute 5 Cups is a fantastic song. The album as a whole just didn't really totally click. It really could have been a lot better. But then came 2021's Draw Down the Moon, which had better hooks, production that fit a lot better across each individual song, and I think the lyrical sentiments just landed a lot better in the execution. So considering I feel like they've gotten better with each album up to this point, I was really excited to hear their self-titled record. Although I also had my doubts considering I'd only really call one of their first four albums great in my personal opinion. But I tried to go into this with an open mind, especially considering this is probably the most critically acclaimed Foxing album to date. And I get why this is getting so much acclaim, in large part because I think the lyrical art is really interesting. There's definitely a theme of the narrator feeling extremely lethargic, and I like how the spotlight is given to the aspects of ourselves that eat away at us mentally that feel like they shouldn't have that amount of power, even though there is a lot more going on in our lives. And this is where I want to be careful with how I discuss this, because as far as I know, I've never actually been depressed. Yes, depression affects us all, myself included, but the vast majority of people don't actually have it as a condition, and I don't want to be ignorant towards something that I don't really understand. But I will say I do see a lot of myself in the writing here, with how the narrator realizes that there's always something to appreciate, even when it seems like everything's going wrong. And I like how it progresses throughout, from the opening track where the narrator realizes that sometimes you just gotta focus on you and those closest to you instead of having a big legacy on the world at large, before eventually hitting some very low points throughout the album where nothing feels exciting, and eventually taking comfort in the fact that even if he can't find a way out of the seemingly eternal malaise, hopefully he'll leave a positive impact on those around him at the very least. And I really like a lot of the scenes that are painted throughout this album, such as in Cleaning, where on the surface it seems to be about worrying about a partner cheating, and yet it feels more like a metaphor, possibly for someone being unsure of their purpose in the world, with one of the most chilling lyrics on the entire album being, I need to exist, but I don't think I'm ready. Now, with all this being said, unfortunately, I do think this album pales in comparison to Draw Down the Moon. And while it's a little hard to compare the two, the main recognizable elements of this band are very much noticeable in both records. And besides, I like that album a decent bit more than this one anyway. And I think it's mostly due to the inconsistency in the production and instrumentation, where even though certain moments connect a lot more like Barking and Gratitude with the flashy synths and great melodic hooks, you also get moments like Hell 99, which has a lot going for it lyrically, but which doesn't really sound as scary as I think it was supposed to, and other tracks like Secret History and Kentucky McDonald's, which try to go into metal sections, I just don't really think they're nearly as vigorous as they were supposed to be. And then there's the 8-minute Greyhound, which feels like it should be one of the best songs here, with such a great instrumental palette which feels meticulously crafted, until you get Connor Murphy's bad Patrick Stump impression, which might be the low point of the whole album, although it is kinda hilarious. And look, I like Connor Murphy's vocals a lot, and his falsetto can work with certain productions, such as the indie rock sound of the previous album. I just don't really think it works all that well in the semi-spooky industrial rock of Spit or the bleak goopy synths of Dead Cat. And really, I'm not saying this album is anywhere close to bad. In fact, I think it's really damn good. What frustrates me about it is that I think it's not that I think it's completely boring or lacking in any substance, it's just that I think there's a lot going for this album, and it feels like it should be great. Again, I really like what's going on in the lyrics. I just don't think it quite reaches greatness for me personally. I'm gonna give this a strong 7 out of 10 with the acknowledgement that maybe I wasn't supposed to love this album. I mean, it seems to be mostly about a lack of satisfaction, so maybe this was all the design. Actually, no, let's not go there. That's getting into a completely different conversation. I think I've said my piece on this one. This is the third studio album from singer-songwriter Clairo, who gained a lot of critical acclaim in 2019 for singles like Bags and Sophia, both of which were included on her debut album Immunity. Now, unfortunately, I thought that album was unbelievably bland and lacking in anything that would make me want to go back to it. I re-listened to it recently for the first time in a while, and I would say it's basically White Bread in album form, but I actually like White Bread. Jokes aside, I will say if it weren't for a few occasional moments where the emotional core felt like it came close to shining through, I'd be a lot more negative on that album. As it is, I think it's just incredibly mediocre. And look, I feel bad for saying this, because I get that there was probably a lot of genuine emotion put into it. I just really don't think the album is good at all, in my honest opinion. And look, I like the direction she was going with in 2021's Sling, with lyrical content that caught my attention a lot more, with the way she discusses her problems with the music industry as someone who seemingly wants to be in the spotlight without all the problems that come with that. But unfortunately, I can't say the album fully clicked for me, mostly due to a lack of strong vocal melodies. The singing and production were a lot better, and thus I was intrigued when I saw this new album getting a lot more critical acclaim than probably any Clairo album. Unfortunately, while I think this may be a slight improvement over Sling, it is yet another reminder that Clairo's music just isn't really for me. Because this falls under a certain genre umbrella that I can't quite describe, but I've noticed increasingly how few albums in this style really click for me, with the sort of laid-back, folk-like pop music that sounds destined for alternative radio stations. And really, at times when it does really click for me, it's typically because of really strong melodies and with lyrics that I personally find more interesting. I mean, Marika Hackman put out an album earlier this year, which I really liked, and it had a lot of the same stylistic fundamentals, but just with a lot more musical tension, more memorable hooks, and writing which connected for me a little bit more. It happens. And personally, I just think that album had a lot more to it as well. But I think the biggest disappointment about this album for me is probably the lyrical content just not sticking as much. And sure, Sling wasn't the most amazing lyrical showing ever, but some moments were at least sort of thought-provoking, and it felt like the tracks tied together a lot more. I generally like the lyrics on that album quite a bit. And I can sort of say the same thing about this album to some extent, but it just feels a lot more surface level with the navigating of relationships where the stakes aren't shown as much, and there's a lot less social commentary and more of an emphasis on emotional appeal. And unfortunately, I just don't think the less detailed writing style really fits with that sort of vibe that it's going for in the lyrics. And look, I think the production has improved a little bit, and the vocal style fits better here than on Sling. The same main issue that I found with your first two albums is still present, though. The vocal melodies are incredibly boring. Now, I don't want this review to come across as being more negative than it is, because look, I do like some of the imagery and storytelling here. I mean, I wish it were more detailed, but I like the description of the desire to be sexy to someone on the song of the same name. It's a creative lyrical idea. And the song Terrapin, it has some semi-descriptiveness that does a good job of encapsulating a moment of joy where all your worries just don't matter. And the feeling of normalcy in a relationship celebrated on songs like Second Nature and Juna, the latter of which is probably my favorite song on the album. It's got a low-key funky groove and some shiny keyboards, which I really like. And I do typically like the production on this album, which is sharp enough in the mix to give this album a little bit more energy. But I just feel like Clairo is a long ways away from truly making an album that really clicks for me. I mean, I'd love to be wrong on the next album, who knows, but I just feel like most of these songs don't really feel fully fleshed out. Maybe I'm being harsher than I should, especially considering the laid-back vibe of this album was clearly intentional. But hey, I guess Clairo's music just isn't for me. I can respect it, I just don't really like it all that much personally, so I'm going to give this a 6 out of 10. It's not a bad album, and if you are into this style, I've seen it described as bedroom pop, by the way, then yeah, if you like the style, you might want to give it a shot. But to me, it's what you'd expect from a new Clairo album, and that's just not personally what I wanted to hear. Alright, here's an album I wanted to get to months ago, and this review is going to be a little shorter than the last three. It's the fifth studio album from Bryan, and for whatever reason, I never really got around to working on this review much a while ago, aside from giving it a few listens. Anyway, I really like Bryan's self-titled 2023 album, so I was optimistic about this new album as someone who is a fan of country music, but unfortunately it just didn't really end up clicking for me. And a big part of it is the fact that there aren't really a lot of standout vocal melodies on this album, and the compositions don't really grab my ear all that much either. And also, while Zach is a good singer, I just don't feel like he has the most commanding presence on this album, at least not compared to the best moments from his self-titled album. And I do think the production has taken a step down too, with some of these tracks feeling too much like rough demos. And while I do think that was kind of the point, I personally think this would have hit a lot harder with a bit of a cleaner sound. Yeah, I like some of the more stripped back moments on his 2023 album, but there are certain tracks here where it just doesn't really fit in my opinion, like 28, which seems to be trying to capture a moment in time with glamour, and I just don't think the messiness of the sound really works. I mean, there are some moments that I like here too. I really like the imagery of the title track with Zach's vocal delivery, which really fits with the vibe of the song. And I love the piano of Bass Boat, and Towers was a really nice pleasant surprise toward the end of the album. And there's also American Nights, which I feel like it kind of has a classic country vibe to it almost, where if you told me this was a classic released in the 70s, I'd probably believe you. and then I realized it interpolates American Pie by Don McLean, which probably explains that. But either way, it's a fantastic song, probably my favorite on the entire album. But I often just find the campfire vibes of this album a little bit annoying, and it's too long and inconsistent to fully click for me as a whole. So look, it's got its moments. I'm sure it's going to get lots of critical acclaim. It probably already has, but I just don't think I can go higher than a 6 out of 10. So Fontaines D.C. are a post-punk band whom I've been hearing about a lot for the past few years, but I hadn't really taken the time to listen to them much until recently. And after listening to their first 3 albums, I wouldn't really say I'm fully aboard the hype train just yet. I mean, I mostly liked what I heard, especially on 2020's A Hero's Death, which had some catchy moments and a few songs which I've added to personal playlists, but I just didn't really find myself truly loving any of those full albums. With that being said, I do really remember liking frontman Bryan Chatton's solo album from last year. I didn't love it, but I probably liked it more than any Fontaines D.C. album, so I was a little more curious to hear this. And it does have a few of the most critically acclaimed singles of 2024 thus far, such as Starburster and Favorite, but I've been surprised by the not super huge amount of acclaim the album has gotten. I mean, yeah, it's been getting mostly praised, but I thought it would be among the most critically acclaimed albums of the year, and it isn't. So look, I gave this a few listens, and I do really like the opening 2 tracks. The title track is a bit of a mellower track with some fascinating lyrics describing a potentially problematic relationship and questioning to what extent we should give in to our own desires at the cost of the greater good, which is made complicated by the fact that our own desires are a small part of the greater good. And Starburster goes in a completely different musical direction, which I was not expecting at all. It's borderline psychedelic rock, and I think they pull off that sound really well. The next 2 songs both have elements that I really like, though, but they just don't fully coalesce into great tracks. And then In the Modern World, which is another really critically acclaimed single, mostly just falls flat for me with some repetition that I don't find particularly satisfying, and the drum production on that track really sounds distant from the rest of the instruments. As far as the second half of the album goes, I think it's pretty good. I wasn't expecting to hear a song sung by another member of the band, but that's what happens on Sundowner. And while I don't like Connor Gurley's vocals as much as Bryan Chatton's, it adds a bit of variety, which I do like. And Connor's vocals are still pretty good on this track, even though the vocal production isn't particularly flattering. And some of these tracks are just mostly pleasant while they're on, without being particularly interesting to me. But then there's Death Kink, which is with its really good groove and a nice guitar solo as well. That was a nice surprise. And then unfortunately there's the closing track Favorite, which did not live up to my expectations at all after seeing all the hype for it. It kind of just sounds like a generic 90s-esque alternative rock song, and the chorus really doesn't hit that hard. I feel like I've got to be missing something with this one. And look, there are a few great tracks here overall. And most of them are at least good, with the worst moments being mediocre and far from awful. So I'll give this at least a light 7 out of 10. It's not super consistent, but I think it mostly works. Not among the best post-punk I've heard, but I do think it's pretty good. I don't think it tops A Hero's Death for me in terms of their album ranking, but I did like this album a decent bit. It's pretty good. I recommend it. I was not looking forward to this album at all. I mean, if you've heard Pale Wave's music, you probably understand why, or at least that's what I would say if my opinions on them were more of a general consensus than they are. But this band actually has quite a few defenders. However, I still don't think it's a particularly unpopular opinion to say that their style of pop-punk is some of the most embarrassing music that I've heard in the genre in recent years. I did a slight deep dive on their discography going into this review, listening to their debut a few times and then re-listening to their other 2 albums, both of which I'd already heard before. And while their debut, My Mind Makes Noises, was more forgettable than anything, 2021's Who Am I and 2022's Unwanted had very few redeeming qualities, and they mostly just felt derivative of so many better artists without doing anything new and exciting, and there was no shortage of cringy moments. Those albums are not good at all. I mean, there's people who like them, that's fine, but I personally just think they kind of suck. So my expectations for this new album were very low. And I guess you could call me pleasantly surprised because this is passable. I mean, it's not great, not even close, but it definitely was not what I was expecting. Because not only is this album not particularly bad, but instead of their previous pop-punk sound, Pale Waves moved into a more dreamy, alternative rock sound, almost shoegaze at points. And I think it's a much better fit for the band. It doesn't feel nearly as clunky, and the emotional appeal of it actually shines through a little more with a more flashy atmosphere. Now, unfortunately, this still runs into production issues, in my opinion, where a lot of the guitars have a slightly rougher timbre than I would have liked, and it kind of throws off the vibe of some songs like Thinking About You, and especially Perfume. The latter is a goddamn shame, because this song probably would have been great if not for that one nitpick. And I don't really like the airiness of this album all that much. I guess it can work, but for the most part, I just think it hurts the album, especially in songs like Last Train Home and Gravity. And some of the writing is kind of obnoxious too, like the power fantasy of Not a Love Song, which is the kind of melodrama that can be insufferable unless you totally nail all the details. And I think this song's a mess sonically as well, and I just don't really think it works. Then you get songs like Gravity, which seem to be about a romantic desire which the narrator knows isn't going to turn into anything, and yet she can't help but fantasize about the slightest possibility, as unrealistic as it is. And I think it's one of the best songs here lyrically. And then there's also Miss America, which seems to be about feeling appreciated when you don't feel like you deserve it, and it being a good feeling regardless, even when it comes with some sort of moral questioning of yourself. And I do think Heather Baron Gracie shows a huge improvement vocally on this album. I'm not a huge fan of her as a singer, but I'll admit she's got a really commanding presence in certain moments, such as the chorus of Kiss Me Again, and especially Seeing Stars, the latter of which has really good production and is easily my favorite Pale Waves song to date, not just on this album. So this is probably the most I've liked the Pale Waves album, and yet it's still only a strong 5 out of 10 for me. I think it's more an album that shows potential than one I really like. And while I don't expect Pale Waves to make a great album anytime soon, they're on their way to making decent music, and at least in parts of the album they've already done so. So, I thought it would be a lot worse, that's for sure. This is the second time in the past month or so that I've reviewed an album by Sadness, and while my first review was quite positive, this one unfortunately is not nearly as positive. I really liked Your Perfect Hands and My Repeated Words, but this album feels a lot less interesting, and I really don't think the dreamy production works all that well with this style. Now, I couldn't find the lyrics for this album when I looked them up, aside from ILY, which didn't really impress me much lyrically. So for the most part, I can't really make this review about the lyrics, but I just don't really find the music all that interesting. I do sort of like the indie rock sound, the sort of indie rock sound of ILY, and the fogginess of it is sort of interesting, but I feel like I would have liked it more if it were just a little bit punchier. And the closing track is probably my favorite on the album, especially with the building tension throughout it, and it's probably got the best vocal performance on the album. But the album just takes a while to really get going, and even when it does, it doesn't really wow me, mostly because it feels like it blends in with a lot of other albums in this vein, with the fogginess of the production and the dreamy atmosphere. I think really this album's main issue for me is it just doesn't feel all that memorable. So look, it's quite a short album, it doesn't feel like it drags on for too long or anything, and it does have its moments, I guess. But after giving this a few listens, I just don't feel drawn to go back to it, so I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Even if you love shoegaze, I don't think you're missing much with this one. I'd say check out that other album. I'd recommend that, but this one, not for me. So this one I don't really have much to say about. It's my first time listening to a John Hopkins album, although he has been releasing albums for over 2 decades now. And I decided not to listen to the rest of his discography before this review, but as someone who has really gotten into ambient music recently, I was curious to hear this. And unfortunately, it's not totally for me, but it's not without its redeeming qualities. I do really like the prettiness of the second track with that nice build throughout, and the eeriness of the fourth track with that awesome percussion really stood out to me as well. And the seventh track is probably my favorite song here, with its transition from super low frequency bass to a much higher pitch later on. But a lot of the synth timbres sounded a little rougher than I would have liked, and I feel like this album could have used more detail. I mean, there are some moments with some smaller details that I really like, but it often just feels kind of one note, and I mean that literally, it is an ambient album. I think this is a fairly enjoyable ambient project, but I don't really think you're missing out on much if you skip it, so I'll give it a 6 out of 10. I guess it works as background music, but I just don't really think it's all that memorable. So this is the 5th studio album from American alternative rock band Neon Trees, who broke into the mainstream with their 2010 single Animal from their 2010 album Habits, which I actually did a throwback review of a few years ago on my website. I highly recommend you don't read that. That was when I was first starting my website, and my reviews from then have aged really badly. But I will say this, I do stand by my thoughts on Habits, and that the first half of the album is really, really bad, and the second half is really good. It's a weird album. I guess I could say it's a mediocre album, but not in the way that most mediocre albums are. Anyway, I recently listened through their entire discography, and while I can't say I'm a huge Neon Trees fan, I think 2020's I Can Feel You Forgetting Me is their best album to date up to this point, which definitely made me excited to hear this new album, even though Neon Trees have been an inconsistent band for their whole career in terms of quality. And the opening track here is certainly interesting, I guess. At the start, it sounded really promising, with the first verse having some really good anthemic qualities, which I really liked. And then you get the artificial percussion in the chorus with that super cringy main line, "You're my favorite days of the week," days spelled D-A-Z-E. And the chorus melody isn't very good at all, and I just completely lost interest in that song at that point. And unfortunately, a lot of this album suffers from the same lack of interesting vocal melodies and messy production, with the drums not having nearly as much punch to them as I would have liked. There are moments where this pops off a bit more, like the back-to-back two best songs in the album, and Paper Cuts and Cruel Intentions, both of which have better vocal melodies than the majority of these tracks, but still not without some of the messy production that keeps those tracks from hitting a lot harder than I feel like they should. And then you get songs like Losing My Head, which sound like any of the disposable pop rock from the mid-2010s that you'd hear on an alternative radio station nowadays, and Recover is easily the worst song on this album, with the bouncy instrumentation that doesn't have any sort of strong groove, and the repetitive chorus is quite obnoxious. But really, the vast majority of this is just mediocre, and it's not that there aren't some elements that I like. I mean, at the end of the day, Neon Trees' music has always felt mostly built on melodrama, which they can kind of sell in certain parts, and sometimes the writing does get a bit more serious too, but the melodramatic vibe of the instrumentation doesn't really help with those moments. And in the more melodramatic moments, the production just feels too messy to really let this hit as hard as the best Neon Trees songs. So while I don't think Sink Your Teeth is a bad album, it's certainly not one I'm going to be going back to much. I don't think its low points are quite their worst, but nothing here is even close to being as good as the best songs from I Can Feel You Forgetting Me. I just don't think this album has all that much to offer. 5 out of 10. Alright, we've made it to the end with this new album from Nightwish, who are a symphonic metal band who I've been hearing great things about for a while, but I actually hadn't listened to them at all until very recently, when I decided to go through all 9 of their albums a few times each in preparation for this review. And while they had some great songs here and there, and Dark Passion Play was a really pleasant surprise with how consistent it was, I can't say I'm all that big a fan of Nightwish. I just don't really think their music is for me. Yes, I like symphonic metal, but a lot of the melodies just didn't stand out to me, and the production was very hit or miss. And especially after listening to that 2020 album of theirs, which I really didn't like at all, I just can't say my expectations for this were particularly high. And I actually ended up mostly liking the production on this album, surprisingly, where the vocals sound really good over top of the breezy strings and punchy percussion, and I quite like the mixing too, with the exception of Spider Silk, where the vocals feel way too quiet and the guitar dynamics are a roller coaster. There are some good moments here, though. I like the subtle build of Hiraeth, with the really great miking of the cymbals. The chorus of Perfume of the Timeless does kind of pop off, and the strings play off of the guitar really well, and the weave. A song that sounds like it would probably be really good in a movie soundtrack. It's probably my favorite track here. But unfortunately, aside from that, there's not really a lot that has really grabbed my attention here. I feel like I might be missing something in the lyrics, but as far as I can tell, it mostly seems like the typical adventure you get in a lot of symphonic metal music, with seemingly a lot of references to leaving an impact on the future and thinking of all eras of humanity, and maybe everything in existence, all as one. Now, I could be totally misunderstanding this, but that's my interpretation. And obviously I don't mean all of that completely literally, but there is an interesting conversation to be had about the philosophy of that. But I just don't really find the poetry all that captivating, and that's probably a me thing. It all comes down to preference. And unfortunately, when there just aren't really a lot of strong hooks here, and the hour-plus length doesn't feel justified, I'm just left feeling underwhelmed by this. It's not a bad album. Maybe I just need to give it more chances. I'll admit to only listening to this 3 times, but I'd rather do other things with my time. The album's really long. I just couldn't really get into it. It's fine, but I don't think I can go higher than a 6 out of 10 on this one. I don't even think there's a bad song here. I'm not sure there's a great one either. It's mildly pleasant background music for me, but I've just heard better stuff in the genre personally. Thanks so much for watching. Feel free to comment down below with your opinions on these albums, and feel free to give me your opinion on my video. I know this was not great. This is kind of a messy video. I'm hoping that in the future I'll get these a little bit more organized and plan them out a little bit more ahead of time. But yeah, with all that being said, thank you for watching, and I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to do with the blog yet, but if you want to read any of my old reviews from my blog, it's simontalksmusic.com. I recommend you don't, at least my early stuff. I read back at it now and cringe so hard like I'm going to when I watch this in a few years. But anyway, thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.